Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. For 4 decades, James Nachtwey has journeyed to the extreme edges of the human experience to document conflict and the darker side of humanity. He is considered to be the greatest war photographer, or rather anti-war photographer, of recent decades. There is no one, but no one, as dedicated and committed as Jim. In short, he is the real deal. He feels a responsibility to show people the real cost of war, and his extraordinarily powerful and yet eloquent images are there to remind us to become part of our collective memory and ultimately to affect change. He believes that photography can evoke a sense of humanity and act as an antidote to war. His main wish, let my photographs bear witness. Ladies and gentlemen, my great pleasure to introduce James Nachtwey.
Well, I guess we're reaching the end of the trail, and I want to take a moment to thank Your Royal Highness and His Excellency and every single member of the exposure team for your warm hospitality and for creating an event of such high quality and high spirits. Thank you all. Journalism, especially in my own country, has come under unusually aggressive attack by politicians in recent years. An adversarial relationship between government and the press is to be expected in a democracy, but the high intensity and low quality of the attacks against the press have become ominous. So I'd like to begin by talking about my perspective on the relationship between government and the press and how social media has become part of that dialogue. The photographs in this first part of the presentation will run randomly as a kind of free association backdrop without immediate reference to the words, and I hope that won't be too disconcerting. Later on, I'll show you images related to specific stories. Like language out of George Orwell's novel, 1984, illogical phrases like fake news and alternative facts have been invented by those in power to undermine the work of qualified journalists and to justify the fantasies of conspiracy theorists. By referring to journalists as enemies of the people, the former President of the United States quoted verbatim the most extreme totalitarian dictators of the 20th century, and for similar reasons, to obscure the truth, create confusion, and polarize the population in order to advance his personal agenda and to consolidate control. Information is power, and in a free society, if power is to emanate from the people, then access to accurate and timely and unbiased information is fundamental to freedom. It enables citizens to hold public officials accountable for the consequences of both their words and their actions, and to make well-informed decisions ultimately at the ballot box. In order to be effective, the information provided by journalists must be factual and reliable, and it must be perceived that way by the public. Public trust is built on truthfulness and transparency. When those in positions of authority perceive the truth as a threat to their policies, rather than a foundation from which to govern for the benefit of society, and they attempt to co-opt and manipulate public trust by subverting the credibility of legitimate journalists, They placed the fundamental values of a free society in jeopardy. Once known simply as the press, journalism started being referred to as the media during the presidency of Richard Nixon in the 1960s. Nixon continually lied to the American people about what was happening in the Vietnam War, including the clandestine bombing of Cambodia, a country that was not involved in the conflict and which America had no right to attack. His illicit tactics had consequences that his lies could not conceal. And a tragic postscript to the bombing was the rise of the Khmer Rouge and the genocide in Cambodia. Nixon understood that his hidden agenda was clearly threatened by the truth, and to deflect public scrutiny away from the truth, he sought to compromise the integrity of journalism itself. His administration was clever enough to realize that attacking the press sounded too much like he was attacking freedom of the press, so he devised the term the media. Because it was not part of the vocabulary of our national heritage and our political birthright, and because it sounded monolithic and faceless, Nixon thought the word would be an effective weapon in his private war to sabotage one of the pillars of democracy, the press, and by extension, the truth. Nixon's administration subverted democracy even further by sanctioning a burglary at the offices of the Democratic National Committee, the political rival to his own Republican Party. But in the end, democracy, the press, and the truth prevailed. Washington Post reporters caught Nixon trying to cover up the crime, and as he was about to be impeached, he resigned, less than halfway through his second term in office. During the Nixon era, the media became synonymous with the press. Today, the term media now includes social media, which has assumed some of the functions of the press, but often without assuming the responsibilities and obligations of the press, adding more layers of confusion to the public perception of journalism and leaving it even more vulnerable to attack by politicians. Legitimate journalism is an element of social media, whether it's created independently or by news organizations. But social media is a form of mass communication so pervasive and unrestrained, so amorphous and so autonomous, it defies definition just as it defies being regulated. It has many faces and it wears many masks. At its best, social media has originality and a fresh point of view. It provides information from places not on the radar screen of traditional journalists or where journalists are not allowed to go. It can be used to unite and mobilize movements of people in a just cause, as we saw in Hong Kong a few years ago. Its effectiveness as a tool for social activism was affirmed by China's efforts to block access to social media outlets. But it can also be driven by darker agendas of conspiracy theorists, troll groups, bogus journalists, and rival foreign powers, whose purpose is to spread misinformation in order to create constituencies around self-serving false narratives, who pose threats against members of the press, who deliberately remain anonymous, who are not obligated by a code of professional ethics and not subject to accountability. When those in power make use of the resulting discord, they're trying to discredit the press in order to cast doubt on the truth, because the truth may not well serve their personal goals, and their personal goals may not well serve society. Nixon was ahead of his time. By referring to the press as the media, he attributed to legitimate journalism what eventually became the most unworthy characteristics of social media. The fundamental irony, of course, is that the press is accountable to a code of ethics and is not published anonymously. At its best, it's motivated by the genuine concern of journalists and editors to seek what is true in order to create public awareness based on facts. It constantly strives to earn the right to freedom of the press. Integrity demands that journalists forthrightly identify themselves, which in many parts of the world also requires great courage. If they violate their code of ethics, they're penalized. Sometimes they lose their jobs. Bona fide journalists work hard to get the facts straight, even when the overall truth remains elusive, as it often does. They try to get their stories as factually correct as possible at any given moment, and as events continue to evolve, to pursue the truth through deeper layers of complexity. Each individual journalist is a single mind, a single sensibility, moving through the uncertainty and chaos of the real world in real time, to tell the stories of what happens to people one by one at the sharp end of history. They navigate dangers and often put their lives on the line because they believe that an aware population is essential and people's voices must be heard, that society cannot function properly without the information they provide and without the stories they tell. It's the combined work of all of them together, print, television, radio, legitimate bloggers and podcasters, that builds the critical mass of information and insight that helps to influence change. Their work is aimed at people's best instincts, generosity, compassion, a sense of right and wrong, a sense of identification with others on a human level, across cultures, beyond the borders of nationality, and perhaps most importantly, the refusal to accept the unacceptable. They create a connection between the people they encounter in the field with millions of other individual minds and sensibilities, those of their readers and viewers. Once public consciousness evolves into a shared sense of conscience, the process of change becomes empowered, and in some cases it becomes inevitable. But as one social issue is resolved, another will emerge. When one conflict comes to an end, another will take its place. The work of the press requires continuous, never-ending engagement. There will always be tension between government and the press, and only if journalists maintain high standards in the face of unmerited political attacks will the press preserve its credibility and public trust, distance itself from unscrupulous social media tactics, and continue to be a positive force for change. During the Vietnam War and the American Civil Rights Movement, when politicians and military leaders were telling the people one thing, photographers were showing us something very different. I believed the photographers, and so did millions of others. When I decided to become a photographer, it was to be a war photographer and social documentarian. I was driven by the idea that a war photograph could become an anti-war photograph. An image of social injustice could become an indictment, crying out for change. I believe people would care if photographers showed them something worth caring about. I was not trying to use what's happening to people to say something about photography. My motivation was to use photography to say something about and to ask questions about what's happening to people. Most of the people affected by war are not combatants. They're ordinary citizens caught in the middle. If someone is afraid, it does not mean they lack courage. Transcending fear is the definition of courage. And for me, out of the violence and chaos of war, mothers and fathers have emerged as the unsung heroes. During an ambush in El Salvador, a frightened campesino shielded his wounded daughter from incoming fire with his own body, an act of selflessness and courage that expressed the fundamental meaning of fatherhood. Excuse me for a moment. During the wars in the Balkans, ordinary citizens organized themselves into militias to attack their neighbors, to carve up the communities in which they'd lived side by side for decades, in order to create sovereign entities for their own ethnic groups. The old city of Đakovica, Kosovo, with a mosque dating back to the 16th century Ottoman Empire, was destroyed by the Serbs before NATO forces entered the country. War creates a new reality. The unacceptable becomes inescapable and then becomes normal. Regardless of nationality, religion, or culture, regardless of the cause, all wars inevitably lead to inhumanity. This is the imprint of a man who was burned inside his home during the Serbian occupation of Kosovo. The family of a Croatian militiaman grieving at his funeral. Photography can humanize issues that might otherwise appear abstract or ideological, or a matter of statistics. It interprets events from the perspective of human experience, not through the mechanisms of political contrivance. During the first day of the battle for control of Mostar, a bedroom, the place where life itself is conceived, was destroyed and became a killing ground. Photographers are historians, but they're not looking backwards to analyze the past. They work right on the edge of time itself, as the present continuously unfolds into the future, and it's impossible to know what will happen in the next moment. They are truly on a journey into the unknown, and on that journey, before anything has yet been written, they record a first draft of history. Each moment captured by their cameras happens once. It happens in an instant, and it's gone forever. The Serbian retreat from Kosovo coincided with the harvest, and amidst the ruins of their farms, returning deportees began to reap their hayfields. A Roman Catholic church was ransacked by the Serbs. The contents of a photograph represent only a small fragment of the events they portray, as seen from one specific point in both time and space. But within their inherent limitations, photographs have the power to make human connections across time and space, and to become part of our collective memory. Kosovar families had been divided during the deportation, and in the camps, people slowly began to find each other. Bosnian soldiers were laid to rest in the same field where before the war they had played football together. One of the most emotionally difficult circumstances to photograph is people's grief. It can only be done with sympathy, respect, humility, a sense of inadequacy. It cannot be done unless the people themselves want the photographer to be there. Many of the people I photographed were exploited and victimized. The powers that be tried to silence them, render them invisible. When a photographer focuses attention on their story, people often see them as a messenger, a means of reaching out to the rest of the world, even in moments of profound personal loss and sadness, as if to say, this cruelty, this suffering, this injustice happened here in this place to us. The fall of the Berlin Wall was one of the rare moments when it was possible to actually feel history moving into a new era. In rapid succession, the Cold War ended, Germany was reunited, and the Soviet Union was dissolved. A part of the world that for decades had been highly restricted for Western journalists suddenly became accessible. What did it look like in those formerly forbidden places behind the wall? Romania had been one of the most secretive regimes in the world. After the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was overthrown, travel restrictions were lifted. I got on a plane and flew to Bucharest, then drove around the country for several weeks. What I discovered was a gulag of children. In order to increase the size of the labor force, Ceausescu required families to have more children than they could support, and his regime created a network of orphanages where children were kept in medieval conditions. Little heat, a shortage of blankets and mattresses, bad food, virtually no medical care. When children became sick, instead of medication, they were often injected with adult blood. A single syringe would be used for an entire orphanage, and sometimes the blood was infected with the AIDS virus. The worst conditions were reserved for children who were labeled incurables, those born with congenital handicaps, often caused by alcohol and tobacco abuse, industrial pollution, and other symptoms of poverty and social neglect. Their only crime having been born in the first place. It was state-sanctioned, institutionalized cruelty that was every bit as devastating as the overt violence of war. Eastern Europe had industrialized with virtually no regard for the environment, for the safety of the workers, or the welfare of the general population. This is a Coke factory in East Germany. If a worker accidentally stepped on one of the iron hatch covers and dislodged it, they would go up in flames. In East Germany, low-grade brown coal from an open-pit mine fueled a power plant which emitted huge amounts of sulfur into the atmosphere, creating respiratory illness among the population, as well as acid rain, which destroyed entire forests. In a traditional farming community in Romania, a carbon factory had been installed without filtration, and the village became covered with black dust. Each day, workers in the factory breathed carbon dust into their lungs, and they became coated in black soot. The air inside an aluminum factory in Czechoslovakia was filled with toxic carcinogenic dust, and 4 out of 5 workers died from cancer at an early age. In 1992, in Somalia, clan warfare broke out. The central government ceased to exist, and starvation was being used as a weapon of mass destruction. Famine, caused by the devastation of agriculture, is probably the oldest and most primitive weapon of mass destruction known to man, and hundreds of thousands of people died. If someone is suffering and in need, it does not mean they lack dignity. We often hear the phrase, compassion fatigue. This woman had virtually nothing left except her will to live. As frail and emaciated as she was, she refused to surrender life. Even in the face of all the tragedy and loss she must have suffered to have arrived at that moment. She had not given up hope. Why should anyone else give up hope for her? During the genocide in Darfur in 2004, government-supported militias burned entire villages, displacing large populations and causing famine. Women winnowed the dust, searching for the last grains of barley. Sick and starving children were brought to clinics hastily organized by the few international NGOs allowed to operate in Darfur. Darfur was designated as genocide, one of the first of the 21st century. At an MSF field clinic during the genocide, as a witness, I had to learn what to do with my anger. I had to use it, channel its energy, transform it into something that would clarify my vision instead of clouding it. In 1995, in order to quell a separatist movement in Chechnya, the Russian army invaded and completely surrounded the capital city of Grozny, a Chechen rebel fighting on the front line. The Russians pounded Grozny with artillery and airstrikes and reduced it to rubble, with the civilian population trapped inside. Anyone could be taken out at any time, anywhere in the city. Pallbearers came to a woman's house to take her husband to the cemetery. A young boy escaped from an orphanage and wandered around the front line as if he was saying farewell to what remained of his childhood. A rite of passage into manhood among the Xhosa people, one of the indigenous tribes of South Africa, who continue to practice their ancestral traditions. Nelson Mandela was a Xhosa tribal leader. He grew up in this part of the country and went through this same ritual. European colonialists created and brutally enforced an institutionalized system of extreme racial discrimination known as apartheid, to oppress and exploit the indigenous population, which was drawn away from tribal land to the cities to find work and were then forced to live in poor, segregated townships. Government riot police fired shotguns at people who were peacefully demonstrating against violence in Soweto, and a 13-year-old boy was shot and seriously wounded. Children in Soweto soaring on a trampoline, like the earlier picture of the boy swinging on the barrel of a tank. This is an image of the transcendent energy and innocence of children in the face of hardship and injustice. a healing ritual in the Indian Ocean. Even in the midst of poverty and oppression, Black South Africans possess a natural physical grace and dignity, which is a reflection of their inner grace. And that quality is what enabled them to triumph in their long struggle against apartheid. In spite of the harsh treatment he'd received at the hands of the apartheid regime, Nelson Mandela rejected vengeance and racism. Instead, he embraced forgiveness, and his moral authority guided South Africa through a peaceful transition to democracy. The genocide in Rwanda was committed face to face, neighbor against neighbor. In 3 months' time, 800,000 to 1 million people were massacred, using farm implements as weapons. It happened in plain sight, yet the international community lacked resolve at a time when intervention would have been truly justified. When the Hutus who had conducted the genocide fled into Zaire, they were struck by a cholera epidemic that killed so many people in such a short time, the dead were carried in bulldozers to mass graves. As I looked into a mass grave, it was like looking at the gates of hell. Later, high officials who had turned their backs on the genocide made apologies, but their regrets did not bring back the life of a single Rwandan. During the war against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, Kabul had been spared, but during the bloody Afghan civil war, 1/3 of the city was destroyed. A coalition of Mujahideen forces known as the Northern Alliance took control of the capital. But rival forces allied themselves with fundamentalist Muslim militants known as the Taliban, and together they besieged and bombarded the city. Eventually, the Taliban seized the capital and became the host and protector of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. The siege of Kabul was one of the final battles of the 20th century, and it set the stage for the wars of the 21st century. The attacks on September 11, 2001 launched a new chapter in history, which has evolved into an ongoing global conflict with terrorism. The immediate response by the United States was to retaliate against the Taliban and to drive al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. Civil wars, continuous terrorist attacks, and the rise of organizations such as ISIS have been some of the consequences of that fateful day that took the lives of 2,753 people inside the towers, 60 law enforcement officers, and 343 firemen. Following the invasion of Afghanistan, the United States launched an unwarranted invasion of Iraq, a harsh dictatorship, but one that had no connection with the attacks of 9/11. George Santayana warned us that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Yet so many of the decisions that drive history are made with such obvious disregard for what's happened in the past. It's not unreasonable to conclude that they're made not out of ignorance or forgetfulness, they're purposeful, arrogant, or reckless, often rationalized by deceitful manipulations of history. And in the gap between power and truth, between political expedience and wisdom, awaits tragedy. Images cut through the cynical, dehumanizing language created by politicians to divert public attention away from reality. Ethnic cleansing is nothing more than a euphemism for genocide, as if there's anything clean about mass killings, the bombardment of civilian populations, torture, and deportation. Helmand Province, Afghanistan, during the American surge. The phrase boots on the ground is an abstraction intended to camouflage the real meaning of sending thousands of young people to fight wars, to lose their limbs, to kill, and to die. Collateral damage is an attempt to confuse the unwarranted killing of civilians, children, the elderly, entire families, with something of no more importance than defaulting on a loan. A soldier survived a roadside bomb that killed 3 members of his platoon, but he suffered from PTSD and traumatic brain injury. An Arizona prison with hard labor, known in America as a chain gang. The criminal justice system is a mirror of society. In the United States, the subject inevitably raises questions about racism and its consequences. Why are African Americans so often unjustifiably gunned down by the police? In New Orleans, white police officers wearing civilian clothes rather than uniforms terrified a black man late at night. They held him at gunpoint, searched him, then released him. Why is a disproportionate percentage of the African American population incarcerated? This man, as a form of punishment, this prisoner in a chain gang was handcuffed to this post in the hot sun for more than one entire day. What should we be doing to eliminate injustice from the criminal justice system? For many people in Vietnam, the American war will never end. In order to destroy agriculture and defoliate the forest, the U.S. military used a chemical known as Agent Orange, which contained dioxin, one of the most toxic chemicals known to man. It's linked to severe genetic defects that have had a devastating impact on every generation of Vietnamese children since the war. The use of Agent Orange was a form of chemical warfare, waged not only against a contemporary enemy, but also against future generations. Justifications were made, but there will never be justice. The pain inflicted on them by foreign powers seeking to win their hearts and minds could only be redeemed by the Vietnamese people themselves through caring and love. The earthquake that devastated Haiti in 2010 destroyed 80% of the schools in the capital, as well as the National Cathedral. Around 300,000 people were injured and 200,000 died. 1.5 million people became homeless. The earthquake in Nepal in 2015 literally shook the walls of houses apart until the roofs collapsed and people were killed by their own homes. A mother mourned her baby son who was buried inside their house. The epicenter was in a region isolated by mountains, and landslides cut off the few villages reachable by road. These young monks were rescued by helicopter. In 2011, a powerful earthquake in northeastern Japan triggered a tsunami that wiped out several coastal towns and caused damage to the nuclear power station in Fukushima, resulting in a meltdown that released radioactive material into the environment. Afghanistan is the world's largest producer of heroin, which is exported throughout the region and the world. No matter who controls political power in the capital city, the drug trade in the countryside continues to thrive. This is a drug rehabilitation facility in Pakistan. In 2016, more Americans died from drug overdoses than died in the wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. 63,600 fatalities, not caused by wars or natural disasters or contagious diseases, but by people killing themselves by using drugs. Drug overdoses have become the leading cause of death for all Americans below the age of 50. This is an image of the funeral of a young woman who was murdered by her boyfriend during a drug deal. A tuberculosis patient in an MSF clinic in Cambodia. Far more people are affected by disease than by war. Tuberculosis is a huge global health problem that thrives on the conditions of poverty, overcrowding, poor nutrition, bad sanitation. Because TB is a disease of the poor, it hasn't received enough attention or support for research and development. This is an operating room in Mumbai, India. In the developing world, TB is the leading cause of death for people with HIV/AIDS. The hospital in Zambia. In rural Cambodia, in a poorly supplied government clinic that lacked medication and medical staff, a mother's love was all that was keeping her son alive. In Indonesia, the massive influx of people from rural areas into the big cities has created conditions of extreme urban poverty. A homeless teenager was living in a train station and had become addicted to sniffing glue to stave off hunger. Fleeing wars in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and poverty in South Asia and Africa, more than 1 million migrants entered Europe in 2015. Yazidi people from Iraq had to wade ashore on the Greek island of Lesbos when their dinghy became hung up on the rocks. More than 800,000 crossed the Aegean Sea from Turkey to the Greek island of Lesbos. The migrants then made their way to the border between Greece and Macedonia, intending to travel through the Balkans to Germany or Scandinavia, often on foot, carrying on their backs what remained of their worldly possessions. The photographs you've been seeing are fragments of memory captured within the continuum of the history I experienced. They were intended to reach a mass audience at the time the events were taking place as a way of raising public consciousness to become part of the process that empowers change. Now, as that same continuum moves relentlessly forward and the events themselves recede in time, I hope these pictures will stand as a remembrance of the people in them, of the conditions they endured, and of how those conditions came to be. As we shared these memories, we bore witness together. Let us not forget.